I just want to give a heads up at the beginning. Midsommar is a horror film that deals with some very heavy material. Obviously, if you've already seen the movie, you know where this discussion will be headed. But if you haven't and you're listening to this, just fair warning, this episode contains discussions of suicide and death.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Ari Aster's Midsommar. Thomas, we were closing in on Halloween and we wanted to discuss something spooky, and why did we land on Midsommar?
Midsommar, I think, for me, is one of the more interesting horror films of the last couple of years. I would say horror isn't a genre that I am super into. It's probably of all the genres, it's probably the one I have the least practical experience with. I mean, maybe unless you count like romantic comedies or something like that. But I've just haven't watched that much of it in my life. But this one in particular hit me in a certain way when it came out. It kind of is slotted nicely into being spooky for me, I think. A lot of horror that's about monsters or ghosts or is just kind of a slasher I can appreciate them on maybe a technical level, but a lot of those movies, for whatever reason, I don't find that scary. But this movie kind of hits that like area of psychological horror. I don't know. A lot of what happens in it I found it actually horrifying, I guess, would be like point number one for why I think it's an interesting horror movie. But then also Ari Aster's direction, I think, is very interesting. It has a very distinct atmosphere and mood and art style. This movie is maybe the closest thing you could pinpoint in terms of what you might get if like Wes Anderson made like a real horror movie. There's one particular shot I'll mention later in this that just sticks out to me as being like bizarrely Wes Anderson. It's almost completely, it feels almost completely out of place, but somehow it works in this. But then also beyond those elements, there's also some interesting ideas and themes at play here that I think will fit well into the kind of stuff we like to talk about. So this was my third time watching it. What do you find interesting about this, and what was your experience watching it and rewatching it?
Yeah, I'm guessing I have more experience with horror than you have, based on what you just said.
Yes.
I used to go to a lot of horror movies when I was in high school because, like, my schoolmates, we would sort of dare each other to not
Right.
be afraid and then go see a really scary movie and secretly be really afraid. But of course, you wouldn't admit it to the classmates. But it's a genre that I've always found interesting. Like you, I'm not the biggest fan of it, especially when it's just about jump scares or
Right.
lots of gore. Like I'm more susceptible to a spooky atmosphere, I guess, instead of deliberately created spooky moment with like a jump scare or, oh, there's a ghost somewhere and something's about to happen, but we don't know what.
Right.
Like I can feel that tension, but it always feels a bit artificial to me, and it can be done really well, but usually it feels a bit cheap compared to horror movies that really get under your skin and really touch on some deeper fears that you might have. That being said, Midsommar does feel kind of like the antithesis of what should feel scary,
Right.
because it's not like we're talking about this in the fall time. Like it's raining outside, the leaves are changing, but this summer or this movie is like, it's bright summer, super bright images. It's not moody in the sense that a movie like Halloween or The Exorcist or even The Shining is moody. That's not to say it doesn't have a particular atmosphere, but it's not one that you expect or generally associate with this type of genre.
Yeah.
And I definitely find that really interesting, although I read that apparently in Sweden the movie is perceived not so much as a horror, but more as a black comedy. And I can kind of see where they're coming from. There is
that's interesting.
some aspect to it that just feels kind of funny. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but if you compare it to like even to Hereditary, which was the movie that Ari Aster made before this one. That one to me, won't spoil it, but that one did have that more classic horror vibe, I guess, and therefore felt much more dreadful in a way.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas Midsommar, there's also a lot of stuff that feels more lighthearted, like the mushroom tripping scene that's kind of funny, even though it still deals with very serious themes. But that in the end is, I guess, leading back into the question of why this movie is, because I think it does have some interesting stuff to say, especially about depictions of grief,
Yeah.
relationship issues. There's also a lot of cultural reflection going on, but which I find interesting, but I'm also not sure if this genre is the right place to explore it. There's some tension there between wanting to critique a certain culture from the perspective of another culture,
Right.
while at the same time also still wanting to have that relationship where you have these innocent people going into this weird, messed up culture that's gonna get them all killed. So there's some tension there between wanting to do something with regards to cultural exploration, I guess, and also being this suspenseful horror movie.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we'll get into all that.
There's like three main things going on in this movie. One is, besides just being a horror film and playing with the tropes therein, there thematically we got a relationship story. There is the grief and like death and dealing with those things and how we relate to them and cope with them. And then there's the anthropological element that you're talking about. That I would see as maybe the weakest element of those three in this movie, or the one that it kind of engages with in the most kind of surface way, but then doesn't really play out entirely.
It's kind of a individual versus collective cultures exploration or comparison.
Yeah.
That to me is the most superficial one. Even though I do think it does add something to the other two elements that you mentioned, the way relationships are formed, the way grief is being dealt with, which never just exists in a vacuum, but that I think this movie nicely shows that all that exists in a wider culture that has certain flaws or can have certain flaws in the way you can deal with those things.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention before we get into that stuff that kind of relates to what you said about its atmosphere being very brightly lit and kind of sunny, and also how this movie touches on something that maybe your average like slasher or ghost monster movie might not, is it never really plays off of jump scares or anything like that. Instead, what I think it deals with is what sometimes people call psychological horror, and I would use that to describe this to a certain extent. It's dread, I think, is the main thing that I would, even more than suspense. There's this very strong underlying sense in this movie of kind of knowing what's coming to a degree, and just the feeling of like dread as that inevitability sort of approaches, which I think works very effectively. And that relates to that it's all out in the open. We see it all brightly. It's not obscured in shadow. There isn't really an ambiguity about what is going on, and that kind of makes it all the more horrifying. And that's not just in the way it's lit, but in the way the story is portrayed. We get all these clues and these depictions of kind of what's coming, and there's very little that happens in this movie that isn't sort of alluded to before it actually takes place. There's even sort of like a 4-panel graphic painting mural at the beginning that sort of kind of outlines like the main beats of the whole story and the seasons, and thematically fits into the movie. But that kind of resonates throughout the movie, where there's all these moments where if you're paying really close attention, especially on rewatches, you see elements of what is coming alluded to before we even get there. And that kind of just plays into this feeling of just like, I don't know, the feeling I had watching it the first time was kind of like, I want to get off the ride. I don't want to be like on this path towards what it feels like is inevitably going to be coming down the pipe. I think this movie does that particularly well.
Yeah, because it does take a while before something really scary happens, or even something that's shocking. And even when it does the first time, with spoilers ahead, I guess, but with the two old people that complete their life cycle and they jump down the cliff. That's like the first big shocking reveal, I'd say. But then it's also pretty effectively argumented why this isn't a scary thing and it's just part of their culture. Like there's not...
Right.
It's hard to feel a sense of malevolence or like some kind of evil presence there when this, it's strange, it's absurd, it's, something that we would never want in our own culture. Although, that's not to say that I think the boyfriend, he also points out like, oh, when our elders reach that age, we just put them in a nursing home somewhere and
right,
no longer care for them. So there's a pretty good argument to be made, or at least that within the context of the movie, that things are pretty much fine for a really long time until they actually start. I think it's when the other researcher he's the first one to get murdered, I think, right? The one who's doing his thesis, he breaks into or did the other guy who beat on the sacred tree, did that happen earlier?
Yeah, he technically is gotten first, but we kind of the reveal that the cult is kind of actually has malicious intent here comes very late. I was keeping an eye on the running time this time. It's at least like almost an hour and a half into the movie, I think. You start to get a strong suspicion that that's coming for much earlier than that. But like you said, it's kind of played off and it's left ambiguous, and you can kind of leave this doubt in the back of your mind of like, oh, maybe it's a different culture, and yeah, this is a very weird thing that seems dark to us, but maybe we can, extend some kind of, I don't know, maybe we just don't understand. But then, there is a point where it crosses a threshold into what seems much more actively malicious. Yeah, that comes very late.
Yeah, because at that first thing where the elders die, at that point the characters they don't yet have to fear for their own lives. Yes. It still feels like, oh, this is just the life cycle that we go through.
Yeah.
And it's only until much later that you actually get the sense that, oh, wait, we actually might not leave this place, or they might not want to let us leave this place even. What version of the movie did you watch, by the way? Because I didn't notice until after I rewatched. I think I rewatched it on HBO or something, just like a streaming service. But that was the theatrical cut. That's like 2 hours, 20 minutes. Yes. But I didn't realize until later that there's also a director's cut that runs pretty significantly longer, like 30 minutes longer. Like that's almost 3 hours.
Yeah. I think it's like 24, 25 extra minutes. Have you seen that version?
No.
So I watched that one in the middle. I watched the theatrical version in theaters and then the director's cut. And then I rewatched the theatrical again this time. And most of it is little bits, not entire scenes that are missing, but little pieces that are added on that kind of further illuminate the kind of tension between Christian and Josh and their anthropological research. And then there's some extra material where Christian is kind of being more, he's further gaslighting Danny and just kind of being a generally horrible person. The big thing that is missing is there's this scene where there's another ritual that happens after the elders die, where they go off and they kind of like, this is spoilers for the director's cut, but they bundle up this kid and they're gonna throw him in the river and he's gonna die or something. I don't remember. It's been a while since I watched it exactly.
I've seen that one on YouTube as a deleted scene,
And that one's like 7 minutes long. That's the main chunk that is missing. And I would say it plays better, I think, without that, because
that's what I thought too.
Yeah, that scene affects what we were just talking about, which it kind of tips the hand a little earlier towards at least, I mean, the audience knows. We know the cult is going to be bad. And there's an interview where Ari Aster even talks about that. He's like, walking into this kind of where it's going. And that was a dynamic that he's working with in this movie is like, okay, a bunch, like 4 idiots walk into, this creepy village that seems too good to be true or whatever. And it's a horror movie. You just kind of instinctually know what is going to happen. But what that scene changes is it tips the dynamic of the visitors and their perception of how malicious the cult is, I think, too early. And it makes it seem like they should have been more suspicious and less susceptible to where things are going. Whereas in the theatrical version, by the time they kind of realize things are taking a turn, they're in too deep. It's too late for them to kind of get out and escape.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a little bit more effective in that way.
So overall, would you prefer the director's cut or the theatrical one?
Overall, I think the theatrical plays better. And I don't think there's really anything in there that is necessary to understanding the story. The stuff that's added with like Christian and Danny that you don't get, you still understand the dynamic of their relationship without that extra material.
Yeah, I already feel the theatrical cut is kind of pushing the limit in terms of pacing. Like by the end of it, I like the movie. I think it's good, but there's a point at the end where I feel like, okay, now I get it. I'm kind of done with it. And then it kind of runs on for another 5 minutes or so. Like I feel the last 20 minutes could have probably been condensed to like maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, not a lot, but just to show that by the end of it, it does feel like it's on the verge of outstaying its welcome and of,
Once things get ramped up and Danny and Christian are kind of really separated and there's the whole like weird sex thing happening and like that section to me, I think runs on longer than it would need to, because by that point it's like you're not riding up the roller coaster anymore. You're like at the top, like waiting for it to go down, and it just sits there a little bit too long. I think the last bit is very effective for me. The final drop, I agree with you there that it just waits a little bit too long.
I think even that very ending, I think it's strong, but it could have been just a bit tighter maybe. Like there's a lot of setup with the final sacrifice, I guess, sort of. And I don't know, I'm not sure how it would have looked if it was trimmed a little bit, because sometimes, somewhat paradoxically, a longer movie can feel better paced than a shorter one.
Right.
But I'm not sure if that's the case here.
Yeah. Want more Cinema of Meaning? Well, Tom and I record an entire bonus episode every month. And the best way to get those bonus episodes is on Nebula. And you can sign up for Nebula right now with the link down in our description. Nebula is an online streaming service created by creators like Tom and I, where we can publish our work early and without any ads. You can see our normal YouTube work there and listen to our podcast on Nebula early and without any ads, but you also get access to a monthly bonus episode when you listen on Nebula. In our bonus episodes, we've talked about movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Drive, Alien Covenant, and a bunch of others. So check out those episodes now by listening on Nebula. The best way you can get access to Nebula right now is through the Curiosity Stream bundle. Curiosity Stream is a streaming service dedicated to bringing you wonderful documentaries. And when you sign up for Curiosity Stream using our code, you'll also get access to Nebula. The entire bundle for the two streaming services is available for less than $15 for the entire first year. You can sign up for that bundle right now at curiositystream.com/cinemaofmeaning, or click the link in the description below. So yeah, maybe we can dive into sort of the themes here. What do we want to tackle first? Relationship elements, maybe. This being like just the most horrifying breakup movie ever created.
I think maybe just start at the very beginning, because we have this, it's a pretty long prologue for the story that is to come. We set up, we actually begin in the wintertime in somewhere in the United States. I'm not sure if it's specified where exactly, doesn't really matter. But the movie kind of opens with, we have a few beats that are set up. We have Danny, who is worried about her bipolar sister, who's left this weird message about, that just raised a lot of red flags for her. She's worried about her relationship with Christian because she feels like she's been just dumping all of her issues on him and leaning on him too much. And then in what I think is a pretty dark twist of irony, there's the scene with Christian where he kind of communicates to his friends that he wants out of this relation.
Yeah.
And that's when it is revealed, or Danny calls him because she's found out that her sister has killed herself and both of her parents along with her, meaning that, now that whole relationship, like that one-sidedness it's just brought to the extreme. And so we have this pretty interesting or fascinating setup where you have this one character who clearly wants out of a relationship that he now has no way to escape from, really, because the kind of the horror that's being dumped on him is just too strong. Like he's not, he might be like a bit selfish or narcissistic, but he's not like pure evil, as in the sense that he's like, okay, you go deal with that, I'm gonna find another girlfriend or something like that.
Yeah.
And so out of compassion, that's when he invites her to come along to Sweden with his friends, go to the village, and that's kind of the basic setup.
Yeah.
But that all takes its time. That's like 20, 30 minutes, maybe even. I'm not sure exactly.
It's a pretty extended sequence before we even get to Sweden.
Yeah.
And I think it sets the tone pretty well. Like, I find that opening particularly like terrifying. This is where one of the strongest elements, I think, of this movie for me is Florence Pugh's performance.
Yeah.
She just embodies the kind of, it's like an underrated ability. I think I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm working on a video about the sound design in Nope, screams and those kinds of things, and comparing it to Jaws, and I've been researching that a lot. But it's like a very underrated ability of performance to be able to make a scream or a wail or a cry that is really intense, but also feels authentic, doesn't feel performed. Florence Pugh just like hits all of those marks throughout this movie of just being like, you completely buy into her just like devastation. It feels very authentic. And I think if that element wasn't there, it wouldn't be nearly as effective of a movie. But the setup also too is a great kind of double bind to get things started, because you kind of, for me, people have different perspectives on this movie. For me, your patience runs out on Christian pretty quickly. I find it hard to sympathize with him at all, and I'm kind of like on Danny's side if you have to pick sides. But you can at least, most people I think will relate to the sort of dilemma that's presented at the beginning, which is like, he should be getting out of this relationship if he doesn't want to be in it anymore. They're clearly not right for each other and it's toxic, and as the movie goes on, you're kind of like, they need to be not together. But also, like you said, he's not like, it also does seem like the right thing to do to not be like, well, I'm going to break up with you right when this very traumatic, terrible thing is happening. So I think that's a good foot to get the disconnect started on. By good, I mean terrible.
To add to what you said on Florence Pugh depicting that deep sense of grief, I think it's also Ari Aster's direction here that's really important, because he did the same in Hereditary. Where did you get around to watching that one?
I haven't seen that, unfortunately. I should have watched that first, but
I'll keep it this completely spoiler free, but Hereditary, it's also a horror movie. There's also something bad that happens at the beginning to a character who, because of that, enters into this stage of almost unimaginable grief. And there's that the performances are somewhat similar, but I read somewhere that a lot of people who have experienced like that kind of grief themselves, that the grief from truly losing someone that makes you want to die yourself, like losing a child or something. Like, I fortunately have not experienced something like that, but I've read from people who have that the way Hollywood depicts that usually is completely off base, because they'll see actors like crying, like or like being sad, crying a little bit, maybe even crying a lot. But that's what some people said was that that's not what that kind of grief looks like, because what it does look like, it's just utter and complete like devastation and wanting to die. That's pretty much what it comes down to. And that's what you see in Midsommar too, where she's just that kind of wailing that you described. I think that's a good way to put it. It's so bodily and visceral and non-performative. It's like this, just pure devastation that comes from within, from like having your inner self completely ruined and devastated. And I can imagine, that's really hard to act. But so yeah, that combination between the proper direction and then having an actress that can pull it off, that's really showing its potential here. And that, I think, is, as you said, really communicating the weight of that grief, both on Danny as well as on Christian, who has to kind of indirectly deal with it, not as a personal grievance, but more as just the weight of that kind of trauma. Like, how do you handle that as an outsider? That's, just as difficult as a question almost as dealing with it yourself.
Yeah.
Probably not worse though, but
right.
They're both challenging in their own right, to say the least. So yeah, I actually, on my first viewing, to move on to your second point, more towards Christian and their relation, or the relation between Danny and him, is that when I first watched the video or the movie, I actually was more sympathetic towards Christian than maybe most other people. I'm not sure why. Like, I saw a lot of people describe their relation as being purely toxic because of Christian, and that Christian was kind of doing a wrong towards Danny, whereas she was just the kind of victim in that relation. I'm not sure if that's the case. I think I agree with you that they obviously weren't a great fit and that they probably would have been better off apart from each other. But I can relate a little bit to that idea that, Christian is someone who, he's presented as someone who just doesn't know what he wants in life. And you see it with the way he doesn't know what to do with his thesis. So he ends up copying Josh's work, which leads to tension there. He's kind of just floating around aimlessly. And I can imagine that's kind of similar to the way he approaches his relation with Danny. Like, he's not, I didn't get the sense that he was an actively toxic or consciously malicious. He was just, maybe, I agree that he was like dragging her along needlessly, that he probably should have just, if he was so insecure about his relation, then he should probably have cut ties with her sooner. But yeah, to me, it just felt like he didn't know what to do. So he wasn't sure if he was maybe he really was in love with Danny. Maybe he didn't love her enough for a proper relationship. And I'm not sure. It didn't feel like to me like he was just this pure toxic guy. It just felt like he was kind of struggling to find his own identity, and therefore also couldn't properly relate to those around him, which obviously hurts someone, or the person who's closest to you, or should be the closest to you, is the one who ends up being hurt the most by it, because she inevitably, as happens in the movie, kind of struggles with that idea, or with that fact that Christian is all like caught up in himself, in his own head, and what he wants to do, what he wants out of life. And so he's kind of turned selfish in that way, and not really considerate of Danny as a consequence. I think it also ties in maybe a little bit, maybe jumping ahead a little bit here, but the way the cultural differences are depicted in this movie, whereas I think Christian really embodies that strong individualistic culture that we have in the general West here, where it's, life, when it comes down to it, is all about you. Like, what do you want out of life? What kind of career do you have? That sort of stuff. Whereas the culture that's depicted in Sweden, or at least this little commune, it's all about collectiveness and sharing things and contributing to the group, or in their case, that would be the relationship. Whereas, he has it kind of the other way around. He's more self-centered in that way, but I just never really saw him as malicious. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
So there's two elements of what you talked about there that I think, to me, kind of get to the core of the most interesting pieces of this movie. Mm-hmm. First, to Christian and the toxic nature of the relationship, or whatever. I think I've sided more with Danny on the first go than what you're describing, but I don't fully remember. And so it's possible I was tainted more by the director's cut, which shows like gaslighting behavior from Christian more explicitly, which I do think kind of paints him more as villainous. Mm-hmm. If we do, in the theatrical cut, if we do get behavior from him, the bad thing that he does is eventually he goes off and sleeps with this girl, which is it's a weird area where he's drugged, he's under the influence of this cult. Like, there's all things, not to excuse him, But it's
But he does seem completely out of it at that point.
both of them are kind of victims of this cult at this point. So it's hard to like completely cast blame on either of them for what's going on, because they're literally being drugged and coerced into doing stuff. And obviously, you know, you're not in your right mind when that's happening. But he doesn't seem very even before he's drugged, he doesn't seem very resistant to this idea of being lured in by this other girl. And that's the most explicitly like villainous thing that he kind of does that I think paints him in the wrong in this movie. But before that, if there's anything that is toxic from him, it's just a general like dismissiveness or inability to engage with her. He doesn't cut the relationship off, but we don't see any sign that he's able to engage with her grief or her situation in like an honest or open way. And that is the element that I think ties into the whole cultural comparison and grief, and perhaps the most interesting part of this movie. Danny is with Christian, and Pele is the one who's kind of ultimately luring them into this cult. And he, in contrast, is presented kind of in contrast to Christian as someone who is very like caring and is paying attention to, he remembers her birthday. And the first kind of key thing that we see in that is he actually asks her about the death of her parents and how she's like this horrifying event. And you can see in that moment where she's sitting on the couch and he kind of asks her about it, and like Florence Pugh's face kind of melts. And there's this tension of, I think within it's setting up. Sorry, I'm trying to put together a complicated idea from several angles at once, so I'm doing a poor job here. But it's setting up the cultural lens of, at the beginning, we're established with this Western society that's very individualistic, like you said. It's also not facing directly the horror of what happened to Danny. So there's this sense where she's not even used to the idea of talking about it, or it, like just even acknowledging it in conversation is this very difficult thing to do. There's no sense of collectively anyone else acknowledging what she is going through or the horror of what she has gone through at the beginning. I think this is set up like it's dark, it's moody. We talked about already how the movie is bright and airy and sunny and everything's out in the open, but that's not the case at the beginning. It is dark and moody and it's snowing outside, and it kind of sets up this like, oh, the modern Western world is one where people are individualistic and horrifying grief can happen, and nobody knows how to really cope with that directly or in a immediate way. And then that's contrasted against this cult where not only will the rest of the community engage with your grief as a community collectively, to say, we feel what you're feeling, we can relate. There's this communal expression of accepting and recognizing those horrors, but also it's all out in the daylight. They're gonna stare at it head on and face it in its visceral, horrifying, unflinching look at that. That's really like a central contrast that the movie is setting up. It doesn't, well, we can get into kind of what it's doing with that contrast then, but I think that's inseparable from their relationship, because part of what makes Christian, I don't know how to put it, but part of his fault in the relationship, in my eyes, is the kind of dismissiveness of how he engages with her grief or the scenario. But that's also one aspect of the movie where, and this is why I think maybe people carry different things away from it or relate to different characters. I do kind of think that element is underdeveloped because we don't get to actually see much of their relationship.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like hinted at in a few places. So going into the beginning, you don't know. Danny like keeps apologizing for stuff that isn't really her fault, or I don't know. There's an unhealthy dynamic in their relationship that we don't get a full picture of. We're only seeing
Yeah.
a few snapshots of. So it's hard to formulate entirely.
Yeah, I think it's easy whenever you talk about relationships or specific examples of relationships to show or to talk about it in the sense that one is in the wrong and the other one is in the right. And I'm not sure if that's a good way to assess what's going on here. I think it's more maybe about just depicting certain qualities of two people that somehow just don't harmonize with each other, or that kind of become inadvertently toxic for both people. Because for the record, the second time I did feel more for Danny's point of view and the way she just could not share, or at least in her experience, could not share her grief and was afraid that she would only burden her boyfriend with all her emotional troubles, while, in a perfect world, that should be the very function of someone you love. That's someone you also share burdens with, and that's something that she couldn't do with him.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can also imagine a version of this story where it's more the other way around, where if you really have it from Christian's point of view, at least at the beginning, he is shown as someone who sticks around, who stays with her. He tries to do the right thing. He's not like shown as someone who's cheating or just talking bad about her behind her back towards his friends. Like, even when Danny's not around, he's kind of protective of her, even when his friends are less into their relationship and kind of hoping for it to fall apart. So I can imagine like a version of this story where you kind of twist it around, where you kind of show the toxicity of being with someone who just constantly burdens you with issues, or just constantly takes from you without really giving anything in return. So someone that is just casting energy, that's just taking up, like that's just eating away at you without you also receiving something from that person. So in that sense, Christian might also not be receiving the kind of love that he wants from a partner, or that he's expecting from a partner, in the same way that Danny is not able to do the same with him. So that's just, for me, it just felt like there was more of a disconnect, or the way our cultures have shaped us individually in such a way that we, even despite our good intentions, cannot communicate with each other, or just cannot be in a healthy relationship with each other. That's not to say, of course, that they excuses all behavior and that there's no way they could have be more proactive in improving themselves or improving their relationship. Christian definitely could have been more attentive, less selfish. But at the same time, maybe even if Danny truly was worried about her burdening Christian with too much baggage, like she is also the one who could have said, okay, I release you from this, like, be free to do whatever you want, just let me be for now, something like that. But I am fascinated by the way the movie kind of elicits this whole discussion that we're having now, and that it's not the one-sided story of heroine girlfriend needs to dump bad boyfriend in a bear suit in a sacrificial hut somewhere and set it on fire. I like that there's more nuance to it, that makes it more interesting to talk about, and that it invokes also these reflections on how we as individuals are shaped by our larger social systems and structures that might have raised us in such a way that they make us incapable of certain interactions, or sharing certain emotions with each other that are just unpleasant or difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
I think, as a sort of side note, one thing that the movie also, sort of tagging on to what you said about this Swedish cult doing everything in the daylight, there's also that element that we in our culture, general Western European / United States, we don't generally have a connection, like a genuine connection with death, and also literally with dead people. Like, we generally do not encounter corpses, like literal physical dead people. And when we do, like when you I think most of us had like maybe a grandparent who died, but they're then kind of embalmed in a way that, or they're kind of presented in a way that just makes them look not dead. Like, we do everything that we can to kind of not stare death into the face, and when we have to, or when we absolutely have to, that's when we make it pleasant. Or at least pleasant enough so that we still can avoid it a little bit. But we definitely do not have that intimate connection with what a literal corpse looks like. And that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what that means for us, like psychologically or sociologically, but that's something that this culture is, or the Swedish cult is definitely more familiar with. They obviously have no issue with throwing their grandparents down the cliff and watching their bodies splatter on the rocks beneath them, and even like doing the mercy hammer kill if it's if the fall enough didn't do it.
Yeah. No, they're very literally looking death in the face in the way that we are not at all comfortable with. And I do agree that I think if there's sympathy that I can find with Christian, it is to that element of his inability to cope with this, with Danny's horror and grief, is not necessarily specific to him. That's more of a cultural thing that he has inherited. There's a very stark contrast between the scene where right at the beginning, Danny is crying and wailing, and he's just kind of sitting there like, I don't know what to do, but just to hold her and let her do her thing. And the flip side of that, which is within the cult, the community, there's that moment where she cries and wails and all those girls are gathered around her and they're like, collectively
I love that moment,
expressing emotion all together. And this is what I kind of love about this movie is, at least I, watching it, feel the tension this entire time. By the time we get to the end, you're like, okay, it's a cult. We shouldn't we shouldn't put our ex-boyfriends in bear suits and burn them. And like I don't condone any of this behavior. But as you're going through this, there's a certain element of it where you can kind of see how this attitude could be enticing. And I think Ari Aster is doing something that's kind of interesting here, which is showing you something that has a little bit of, it's kind of an appealing antidote to this thing that he sets up at the beginning as there's a vacancy in this culture and we can't deal with grief properly and we're out of touch with death and all of these things. And then he gives that to you and is like, oh, here's an alternative. Here's a community where they are and where they do grieve communally and where they can express their emotions and all of these things. But then that cult is like, but then it's like a creepy death cult that lures people in and offers them as sacrifices. So you can, it kind of like can be a little bit enticing, but it's still ultimately horrifying.
Yeah, that for me is where where I feel the most conflicted about this movie is that I agree that it definitely and almost explicitly like offers a better alternative culturally to Danny than she has.
Right.
Where she came from, but then it also shows, it still has to be that horror movie. So it also kind of indirectly says that culture is or those elements of those culture are undesirable because they also lead to that, the sacrifices and the bloodshed and the violence and the horror stuff. And that to me, I'm not sure if that's something I find meaningful or like well put together in a sense in terms of like what message it really conveys.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine this movie as not as a horror, but as a genuine drama that ultimately ends being more inspiring by offering that kind of antidote, as you said it, to our culture in the sense by taking elements from older cultures that we have lost touch with. And so, I'm not sure if in that sense, if you're just looking at that thematic element of that, of the movie being a horror movie actually adds to that or eventually does just detracts from the kind of inspiration that people can take from that. Because I think there are genuinely good messages presented to us through that cult, as you said, through Pele, who is the more thoughtful, attentive friend who connects people together, like he's introducing everyone to their friends, they making sure everyone's comfortable. There's the whole communal aspect, the shared grieving, which, as I said, was a lovely scene. But, then it also has to, it's almost a shame that it then has to become that other movie too, where, oh no, it's the good cult that's been healing my pain is actually evil. And
Yeah.
So that's where I feel a bit conflicted. It doesn't bother me too much, but
Yeah, that's kind of where I said at the beginning, I think that as like a genuine quote unquote anthropological examination of two different cultures, that's where it feels kind of the shallowest. And maybe that's just my perspective, but it's hard to get a finger on where Ari Aster is really coming from, because it does seem like he has a handle on, or at least he's trying to explicitly present this idea of an unhealthy coping with grief in Western, for lack of a better term, society. But then, yeah, he's, like you're saying, he's ultimately painting the antidote as the villain, kind of, in a sense here. Yeah. That just leaves you with like a weird, conflicted vibe. It kind of works on one level where that's kind of how cults operate, I think, in that they provide something to the members that is alluring, that gives them something that they're not getting from society as a whole. And often it's vulnerable people who have had some kind of trauma in their life, who they do need community, they do need an outlet or a way to cope. And then they get lured into this thing that like gives them some kind of relief or way of dealing with that, but then preys on that and turns it into something terrible. So I can appreciate that element of it, but I also feel the same conflict that you're talking about, which is like, I think we have an unhealthy relationship to grief in this society. We need a more healthy one. And so it gives me a weird vibe that this movie is kind of presenting that and then going, and it's a spooky, horrifying, terrible thing. I think most audiences are probably not going to walk away from this movie going like, oh, communal ways of dealing with grief are actually bad because it's going to lead to us killing our grandparents at 72 or something. I don't think most people are going to take like that message away from this movie, but it does kind of undercut this movie actually having a message. It doesn't really have a message by the end besides, I don't know.
I guess for Danny, it's the victory, but I can imagine, to the film's credit, that it gets so over the top and absurd by the end of it that you can kind of separate, okay, like this part was like genuine reflection on our culture, and this part is just the entertaining movie part. As I said, it's not something that bothers me or ruins the movie for me from having like this deep message, because I'm not sure there's supposed to be one. I'm also wondering, the way you talked about cults preying on the weak. Like, does it actually prey on Danny, or does it, because it seems to only elevate her or kind of integrate her into their own structure. It's more like even the other ones, like, I'm not sure what the exact plan was if the others went along with everything, because you have the two British people, I think, the kind of secondary characters that also get introduced to the tribe, and they kind of freak out after the incident with the elders, and they want to leave, and they're murdered because of that, or at least that is implied. They want to escape, and they want to so that's why they're killed. Mark, he's the one who gets killed probably because he desecrated the sacred tree. Josh, who's killed because he tried to copy their sort of holy Bible against their wishes. So he's kind of like, you can make the argument that he was going to bring information that wasn't supposed to be for the outside world outside of there, and so they had to, or they felt the need to stop him. As for Christian, he's obviously used as a sort of, the kind of bulls they used to inseminate other cows. Like, that's kind of what he felt like he needed. Right. They needed outside genes to prevent too much inbreeding. But, so for most of them, like, I wonder what would have happened if they had just accepted the cult for what it was, and maybe even desired just stick around and go along with everything. Would that still have led them to be murdered like they were now? But I'm not sure.
By the end, you have the feeling early on that they're getting killed because they're getting comeuppance for, like you just detailed, all the things that they're doing that kind of violate the laws or rules of the community. But then towards the end, they're like, oh, we needed 8 sacrifices or whatever, and it kind of seems like it's all been preordained. And there's also this vibe at the beginning, if you pay attention to how the community interacts with everyone as they're first being introduced, they're like welcome, welcome. But then when they talk to Danny, they're like, welcome home. They direct this very specific energy at her. And it feels like that's where maybe the movie, I think, is less developed. It's like Pele, supposedly his whole deal is to like bring people in so that this thing can take place, but they have no backup plan. I guess they're all just trusting that it's going to take place, because Danny only ends up coming along because Christian goes behind everybody's back and invites her. So Pele's not really doing a good job of like luring people in if Danny is so necessary to this whole process.
Maybe it's precisely because she wasn't selected that she was able to kind of rise within the ranks, because she wasn't deliberately, she kind of came along as an afterthought. So she was the sort of upsetting factor in that whole scheme of things that they probably do like every year. It seems cyclical in the way they talk about at a certain age, like the cult members, they go out on that pilgrimage, and then it's kind of suggested that that's when they go on that little tour, bring back some tourists and sacrifice them, or use them to expand their own gene pool and not end up with too much inbreeding. But
this is where I think for me the movie ultimately makes more sense, less as a literal reading in that sense, and more in one of the things I like is there's this symbolism of the seasons, and you have winter, spring, midsummer, or summer, which is where Midsommar happens, or winter, spring, summer, fall, and then it goes back to winter, and they kind of detail that as cycles of life, and they talk about how Midsommar is like, I forget exactly what they say, but it's an age range, and it's the age range that these characters are in. And it's also what's happening in this movie. And it's kind of a period of transition and death and rebirth. And it's the sort of this pinnacle, and where things are at their hottest and burn no higher and then fall off. So ultimately, I think this movie works best as this kind of less like, oh, what is actually happening to Danny literally, and more as a grappling with death and grief and a breakup and a failed relationship, and coming to a point of catharsis and letting that die, and then coming out the other end and being reborn into this state of accepting and letting that past die, and being able to look more squarely in the face the reality of death and kind of cope with it and move on. I don't know, that's kind of like emotionally where I'm at the end. I don't know if it's...
I think that quite beautifully captures it,
Yeah. I don't know that it has something to say within that or about that, but that's the kind of emotional arc that I'm on, where by the end I feel the like catharsis of Danny. I think like it works pretty effectively for me, where that's where I think I kind of ultimately, even if I can be sympathetic a little bit towards him at the beginning, ultimately I don't feel bad for Christian at the end. I'm kind of like emotionally in Danny's boat. Not that like Christian deserves to be put in a bear costume and burned, but but just like emotionally I'm caught up in the catharsis of that. And so I think that's probably where it's most effective. And this is where I think I really like this movie, and after watching it 3 times, I'm kind of like, I think it's good, but I don't know that this is a movie I'll keep coming back to, because the more I like, I think it resonates and works for me on a very visceral level, but as I start to like pick at the pieces of it, it hasn't been enhanced through further viewings. Like each time it's been a little bit less, which doesn't mean it's a bad movie, but it's unlike some other movies where they expand in their impact as you watch them more.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what we talked about in Nope, is that it feels like a movie that has some things to say about various different subjects, but doesn't have like one cohesive thesis that's being explored and carefully examined. And, that's fine. But yeah, I agree with you that it's probably not the kind of movie that I'll be coming back to again and again. But now we're both still in the midsummers of our lives. So for now, it's still relevant. But so what was the Wes Anderson shot?
Oh, there's a moment. So when they're building up to the ceremony, where the old people jump off the cliff. There's a shot from behind and you can see the entire crowd, and it's kind of symmetrical. The cliff is in the center, and there's a weird character with like a flute or some kind of instrument, or I don't know, they're holding something. And they turn and look back right at the camera, just kind of acknowledge its presence, and then they look back up at what's happening. And it's like, it's such a Wes Anderson kind of moment. I've never seen anything like that except in a Wes Anderson movie. There's another kind of similar but more subtle moment in a few other places that have to do with like characters like looking towards the camera. I don't really know that it means anything. It's just I think it's kind of a stylistic tick. But that one specifically just like strikes me as, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One last question. What did you think of the usage of psychedelics in this movie? Because you have like two very significant scenes. One at the beginning where they do mushrooms, I think, which kind of goes bad for Danny. But then at the end, I think she does it. She's again doing it as she's doing the May Queen dance thing.
Yeah.
Or she looks down at the shoe and she kind of sees that similar vision as the one that she had when she did it the first time, where she kind of saw the grass growing through her hand. But in that scene, it felt more like she embraced it.
Right, yeah.
I'm not sure if that already answers my own question as to the progression of those, in between those moments where she's kind of introduced to this reality altering experience, and the first time it's rejected, the second time she can kind of flow along with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
You summed it up pretty well. I think it's mostly effective in kind of introducing the fact that these characters are in this psychologically vulnerable state, and makes it more scary in a sense, because there's this trope in horror, I think, a lot of times when people are getting sucked into this vortex of the inevitability of the horror and the plot, where people are like, oh, why don't they just run? I would just run away, is kind of like, I would try to escape or something. And that doesn't really work here. You couldn't have that. Like, this movie can't end with Danny being like running through the woods and they chase her down and then like club her over the head. It's just like, that's not the move. So I think having that element of they're impaired a little bit keeps it horrifying, but helps keep them locked in, and we understand how they get kind of enticed into this world a little bit. But also, yeah, it does illustrate the progression from the beginning to the end. I like that. So one of the things I wanted to mention that I didn't earlier, and maybe this is a good kind of closing point, but one of the things I think that makes this movie effective for me is that it opens with what I would call like true horror in a sense, or like an accessible domestic horror. Most of us, fortunately, thank God, will not have something as horrifying as what happens to Danny at the beginning happen. But it's not a monster. It's not a metaphysical thing. It's not even a weird cult in another country. It's just mental illness, a horrifying event, a suicide. That's things that are much more domestically accessible to the average human than, getting enticed by a Swedish cult is. And setting up that event at the beginning kind of underpins the horror of the rest of the film, where as the stuff in the second half is happening, in my head, I'm kind of like, okay, this is fairy tale, fantasy land. It's not real, even though it's based in Swedish folklore, and some of these traditions are like based in some level of reality. This is not a thing that is ever going to happen to me. But then there's this sense that underpins all of it that I think they do a good job of setting up at the beginning, where the horror and devastation that Danny is experiencing at the beginning is never really resolved. And that first trip is a great example of it, where she just hears the word family, and then all of a sudden everything starts to go bad and go sour. I love the tension that sets up of everything feels so on edge, because it feels like at any moment in this movie, the real devastating horror that is at the beginning can just like leak back through into this world. And then it kind of ultimately subverts that by not having that's resolved by the end. And she kind of lets go of that and is able to kind of accept a new family, as evil and, terrifying as this new family is. But she's able to accept that, and it, instead of dissolving into horror, it kind of dissipates into this joy and freedom or whatever that she seems to be experiencing at the end. Danny finds freedom and joy, at least emotionally, relief and a catharsis in that. And that's what's so horrifying to me about this movie is I get caught up in that and I kind of feel it at the end, but then you're like, it cuts to black and you're left with sort of the reality of what that looks like for her. And you're like, oh,
that's
gross.
When the horror begins.
Yeah, that's when the horror really begins. It's so gross that she finds something that she needed within this terrible thing, and it leaves you like with the willies, which is what I guess what a horror movie should do.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show, be sure to check us out on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula, where you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get access to monthly bonus episodes. On Nebula, we for example covered, among many others, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Drive, Alien Covenant, and Upstream Color. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. To learn more, visit curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.